Hello.
Hi.
Let's start from this piece. We go around the exhibition
Okay.
piece by piece.
Okay, this is a photograph of my mother and my middle sister, Michelle, and there we grew up and in a very old Victorian house, and there were the inner courtyards, and here they are just walking through into the inner courtyard that went into the kitchen, and this is called Hand in Hand, Here We Go.
Thank you.
And this work, which it's kind of sometimes a challenge to see, but it's sort of meant to be like that. It's a hand engraved and etched work with side-lit LED lights, and it's meant to represent the figure of my mother. The fact that she is now a source of light for me, a faint source of light for me. And here we have a collaboration work which has a long story, but I'll try and keep it short. There is an audio soundscape of some pieces taken from a corrupted video of my mother's voice. And I worked with a friend who's good with doing editing and sound work, and a glass artist to put together this radio and soundscape of my mother's voice talking to me from somewhere else. So. And here we have the first work in a series called Raveling, which is, the word ravel is based on the undoing of threads that make up a piece of textile. So this relates to examining and unraveling this relationship between mother and child. And some of them are using archive photographs. The first one is my mother and with my oldest sister, who is about a day old, or less than a day old in that picture. And then there are embroidered texts that I've written. Under here is a photograph of my mother's garden, her last garden. We both shared a passion for gardening, so this is something that we would communicate with each other. And I remember I always used to hate it when she would talk to me in the spring and say to me, you know, my geraniums are coming up, and you know, I've got them in the greenhouse, and there's kind of a metre of snow in my garden and I can't do anything. So, you know, I was like, Mummy, don't do that. Okay, and then, so these works sort of examine, in a sense, aspects of our relationship and also the mother and child. This is a saying that my mother used to say: a little bit of powder and a little bit of paint makes a lady what she ain't, which means we don't need to paint ourselves. We need to develop a confidence in ourselves, in the natural self, that we don't need the cosmetic self, which was a very affirmative thing coming from my mother. And this photograph was actually taken on my mother's 80th birthday. We organised a great big birthday party for her. And she had this really cheeky smile. Most of the time she was frowning, but and the words in this piece of writing are about finding that special smile. And underneath is a lock of her hair taken after she died. And the final piece in this series is actually the embroidered work that inspired the etched lead light work. Which refers to how we are bound together, whether we like it or not. There is this bond and a thread. Here we have a series of embroidered t-shirts that's called The Circle of Life. And this arose from sitting and listening to people talking about their lives, their relationships with loved ones, their parents, and that we seem to follow a fairly standard circle, and it repeats. And we can be affected by the relationships that our parents have. It's called unconscious conditioning. That our parents or those who bring us up, we learn from their behavior. And here we have a painting, and this painting is actually a painting of me when I was somewhere between, I would say, 10 and 12. And I'm wearing a dress somewhat similar to my childhood dress that hangs between the works. And I'm wearing a mask and I'm screaming. It's basically that I think children, when they go through this morph into adolescence, they are struggling with themselves, with their identity, and most of the time, because everyone says that a teenager is like an alien. I mean, their hormones are changing, their minds are changing, they don't know who they are, and if they don't know who they are yet, it's very difficult for the parent to know who they are. So it's a kind of dialogue about the fact that you're in this process of trying to find out who you are. Internally you're screaming. You don't know how to communicate it because you don't know what's going on. Your parents haven't got a clue what's going on. So it's the part and parcel of this parent-child dynamic. Here we have a photograph of my mother and my oldest sister. My mother is in the process of knocking down the old stables. And there's actually a part in the photograph of this where my mother is actually turned to the camera, and she, in the partner photograph, which isn't here, she is smiling. I have never seen my mother look so happy as she swung, and this bar here was a heavy iron bar with a pad of material wrapped around it, and she swung this bar and was knocking down this building. So it was like she was exercising her own demons in doing this. And here, and here we have a piece which, in a sense, it took me a while to write this. I hate writing, but this is, in a sense, a dialogue between myself or the child and the mother, but it comes from a time when the child is then an adult and you look back at your parent as a human being rather than the parent. you look at them as the person. And the sentences are split, the piece of prose or writing or whatever you want to call it is split between the two because they belong to each other. They don't exist without each other, the child, the mother. They don't exist in isolation. And it's only through this relationship that this realization has, or revelation of the relationship has been able to be fruitful. Here we have another photograph from my personal archive of myself and my oldest sister, and she has the drum, which she walked everywhere with this drum, beating this drum around the garden. And there is a relationship later on. You'll see some works that relate to this. This is a piece that is embroidered onto one of my mother's handkerchiefs, and it has a saying, when a child is going through something, or even a teenager or a young adult, my mother would say, it's just a storm in a teacup, it'll blow over. So it's a term that she used with us. But it can feel very, condescending, meaning that what you're experiencing isn't important. It's meant to be a supportive affirmation, but it can feel like a dismissal of what you're experiencing. So these are some of the flip sides. So the first room that we were just in, most of the time dealt with the lighter side of the relationship. Here we move into something a little, let's say, a little bit more complex. And the main piece of work in this room is my bed of nightmares, because as a child I had recurring nightmares. And my recurring nightmare was that I was chased by a bull. And most of the time, in my dream, all my family were behind me, and the bull was chasing me, and I was leading the bull away from the family. And you can imagine, for a child, this was terrifying. But the piece is made up of this bull's head. The bed is, instead of springs in the bed, we have the soles of old shoes, and these represent our families and those that have gone before us, and those people who influence who we are. We carry the character traits of our ancestors. And also you can see that instead of on one end of the bed there are a child's Wellington boots. It's because I grew up wearing only Wellington boots. I lived in Wellington boots and a t-shirt. So, and there is in this room, the materials are quite different. There's a lot of very hard materials. Iron, wood, whereas in the other room it's much softer, it's textiles, threads. So the harder materials represent a harder side of this dynamic, or this special relationship that one had, that there is between mother and child. And on the wall we have a little paper house. This paper house I made from memory, because I had very few photographs of the home where I was born. So I decided to try and make this a paper house from memory. And it sits on a mantel shelf because in the bedroom where I grew up there were old Victorian fireplaces. And always my mind disappeared into the fireplace, the imagination. If I had nightmares, I would try and find a place to retreat, to feel safe. But the funny thing is that in the process of making the house, and in my mind's eye, wandering the rooms in order to get the spaces correct, I somehow demonized the fears that I had growing up, the nightmares. It's written in a book called Sapphire and Son. It's written that Brown Acres was one of the haunted houses in the UK. So I grew up with stories that the house we lived in was a haunted house, and that there was a lady who walked the house. So my older sister was convinced she saw her. But you know, that could be childhood imagination. You never know. So, and then we move to some hand embroidered textiles and drawings with sayings that I remember my mother saying to us, that you can use the phrase, they were drummed into us. Now we all know that parents say certain things to their children to get them to change their behaviour, get them to behave well, get them to do what they want. So it felt natural that these textiles, these embroidered sayings would be stretched and put as drums. This particular one that says the world is your oyster. Oh, we're getting in, yeah. Now, again, this should be a very positive thing, and it's a parent saying you can do whatever you want. You know, you're amazing, but it can also be a huge burden to live up to an expectation that you are amazing and that you can do anything you want. But if you don't feel like that and don't become that thing your parents want you to become, if you have to live up to something or fulfill the dreams of your parents, you feel you're letting them down. So there are mixed messages in a lot of the things that are included in a lot of these works. And then finally we have a piece that's called the umbilical cord. So the umbilical cord, of course, is the thing that attaches us and is our life source while we're growing in the mother's womb. But when you leave the womb and the umbilical cord is cut, then what is it then that gives you your life source after that? And it is our inherited ancestors that continue to feed us in how we proceed through life. Whether it's good or not, you have this unconscious conditioning that has been carried from generation to generation. Some of it is very positive, some of it can be extremely negative, and it can be extremely damaging. My own mother had, this is my mother, this is her mother. My mother and her mother had an extremely bad relationship. And it was felt. I grew up knowing it. And you could ask, how has that affected me as a child? And how has that affected me as a mother? My mother got on had a much stronger relationship with her grandmother than she did with her mother, a much more nurturing relationship. So, I mean, in this exhibition, as I said earlier, I'm not so much dealing with, I am a mother, so I'm not so much dealing with the relationship between myself and my daughter. That's coming later, that might come later, and that's maybe a story of my daughter to tell. So it's, but here you have me, my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my great-great-grandmother. And I'm afraid I actually don't know much about that relationship, but I know a lot about the relationship this end. So. But it's like they are in the bed with me when I sleep as a child. They're in the bed with me as I sleep as an adult as well. So there's a wonderful saying, wherever I go with you, which means that you carry everything. You can't put, you can't get away from yourself. You can't get away from your past. You can deal with it and recognize it, but it's a mistake to try and put it away, I think.